Hey everyone, so for this video, I'm going to rank all the Stanley Cup champions ever since the start of the salary cap era back in 05-06. We have a total of 17 cup winning teams here. It's going to be really fun kind of reminiscing about how each of them ultimately were crowned Stanley Cup champions. And these are teams that were dominant in the regular season and through the postseason. These are teams that came out of nowhere to win the Stanley Cup. These are teams that struggled through 7-game series and had to really be pushed to the brink of elimination multiple times, and teams that were loaded with Hall of Famers. So because of all those different factors, I really don't think that there's one definitive way to do this. Now, I asked you guys about this in our community tab, so I'll be sure to pull in some viewer comments as well. And let's have fun with this one. And let me know in the comments below what you think of the rankings and if you have any other ideas for rankings, especially as they pertain to the Stanley Cup playoffs. All right, so let's get into it. But first, a word from our wonderful sponsor, and that is World Hockey Manager. The NHL offseason's already here for a lot of us, myself included. So rather than wait for your favorite team's GM to make decisions about next year, well, have you ever thought about doing that yourself? With World Hockey Manager, a free-to-download game for iOS and Android, you're the owner, the GM, and the coach of your own franchise. It all starts with naming your team, choosing the logo and colors of your jersey. Who doesn't love that? And once you've done that, you're training your roster, you're scouting and signing free agents, and you're facing off against players from all over the world in daily ranked games and tournaments. Now, speaking of which, beginning on Friday, May 12th, World Hockey Manager is hosting a World Cup coinciding with the 2023 IIHF World Championship. And at this time, players will actually be able to acquire heroes from World Championships past and even NHL pros. And get this, guys, if you really want your team to become an absolute wagon, you'll be able to purchase a YouTuber pack. So you'll be able to recruit several hockey content creators out there, including yours truly. To download, just click the link in the video description or the pinned comment down below. And once you're in the game, you can enter this code to receive 100 gold coins so you can start upgrading and augmenting your roster right away. Just tap settings, then the green redeem voucher button, and then enter this code. And there you have it, Twisters. There's no better time to check out World Hockey Manager than right now. And who knows, guys, maybe I'll be able to help you on your championship run. All right, back to our video. Now, one thing I did with these rankings was I calculated a performance rating. And what that is it's a ratio between the team's opposition and how many games it took to defeat those teams. So that's not going to be the basis of these rankings, but I will refer to it from time to time. So again, it's called the performance rating. All right, so we're going to start at the very bottom at 17th, and I've got the 06 Carolina Hurricanes. Now, in terms of the roster, this is actually one of my favorite teams, but the reason why it's at the bottom is for two reasons. First of all, I know I just said that performance rating won't be the completely all-telling statistic here, but they were the second lowest as it pertains to performance rating. And second of all, this Hurricanes team, they hadn't made the playoffs in the previous couple of seasons, and afterwards, after this run, they weren't very good until 09 when they went back to the conference final. So they were a bit of a flash in the pan. Nonetheless, they did have some fantastic players on this team in the likes of Rod Brind'Amour, Mark Recchi, Doug Weight, Eric Stahl, Mr. Game 7 Justin Williams, Matt Cullen, Corey Stillman, and of course the Conn Smythe winner there, Cam Ward. But again, it wasn't like a team that was built for longevity necessarily. Their biggest opposition was arguably the Montreal Canadiens when they went down 2-0 in that series. In the Stanley Cup final, they went up against the Edmonton Oilers, who were an 8th seed, and went on this crazy run and beating some awesome teams in the Western Conference at that time, and they took the Hurricanes all the way to Game 7. So anyway, if there's got to be somebody on the bottom, unfortunately it's the 06 Canes, but all these teams are Stanley Cup winners. In 16th, I have the 2015 Chicago Blackhawks. This was the 6th Stanley Cup in franchise history and their 3rd over the course of 6 seasons. One thing that really stood out to me about this run were some of the defenses and goaltenders they had to beat. We'll talk about that with some other series as well, but they had to get through Pekka Rinne. They had to get through a really tough Anaheim Ducks defense. Ben Bishop was still with the Tampa Bay Lightning, and that's who they faced in the final. And also, speaking of the Lightning, they were the top offense that year in the NHL, and this Blackhawks team, in their 4 victories in the Stanley Cup final there, they held that Tampa team to only a total of 3 goals. So that's magnificent. We'll talk about the core players for this team later on, but really the additions, the key additions that I want to call out here. First of all, Teuvo Teravainen was just breaking into the NHL, and also Kimmo Timonen, a long, very successful career in the NHL, and he came out a Stanley Cup champion when he decided to hang them up. In 15th, I have the 2017 2017 Pittsburgh Penguins. This is their 5th Stanley Cup and the 3rd in the Crosby and Malkin era, and it's the first time since 1998 where the NHL has back-to-back Stanley Cup champions. One big thing that stands out here is that they won this one without Chris Letang, so I didn't forget that. They had some iconic moments as part of this run, especially that Chris Kunitz goal in double overtime of the conference finals against the Ottawa Senators. And then in the Stanley Cup, I mean, really, there was no stopping the Penguins at this point. I think once they reached the conference final, pretty much everybody realized that. But I want to call out that they actually shut the Predators out in the final 2 games of that series. Yep, we can talk about the core a little bit later on when they're first starting out and winning Stanley Cups. But added to this roster after the 2016 run, which I'll touch on, you had Jake Gensel, Justin Schultz. He provided a lot of offense in that run in place of Chris Letang and Connor Sherry too. Not to mention, they actually had to win this one with 2 goaltenders. So they started out with Marc-Andre Fleury. He did terrific, and then Matt Murray came in relief of him and was able to sort of continue what he did in the 2016 postseason. In 14th, I had the 2021 Tampa Bay Lightning. Yes, we'll talk about the 2020 team a little bit later, but the 2nd of their consecutive Stanley Cups, the 3rd in franchise history. And I know that this was a shortened season. This was a bit of a bubble playoffs for some teams out there. But at the end of the day, somebody had to win it, right? So this team had to go through some better competition, I think, versus 2020, except for the final. So leading up to their final against the Canadiens, they played the Panthers, the Hurricanes, and then the Islanders. The Islanders always gave them the toughest run for their money, I thought. And then ultimately, they had to play the Montreal Canadiens, who for most of the season were actually not that good of a team. But with Carey Price, they were able to get all the way to the final. And that's why it's not ranked quite as high as some out there might think. But the performance rating that I talked about earlier, this team was actually the 5th best. In 13th, I have the 2019 St. Louis Blues. Some of you out there probably think that they're too low. But anyway, 52 years fans waited for a Stanley Cup in St. Louis. So yeah, that's what you absolutely have to lead with here. They weren't per se a dominant team, but they did play playoff hockey. They were tough. They were physical. Of course, they had Craig Berube come in as head coach in place of Mike Yeo, so you definitely have to acknowledge that. They had to beat some good goaltenders in the likes of Connor Hellebuck, Ben Bishop when he was with the Dallas Stars, ultimately winning in Game 6 of overtime there, and Tuukka Rask for the Boston Bruins. They had great goaltending. They had fantastic players, a couple of Hall of Famers. Pietrangelo could be a future Hall of Famer. Same with Ryan O'Reilly. Of course, Jordan Binnington, David Perron, Vlad Tarasenko, Pat Maroon. All right, in 12th, I have the 2016 Pittsburgh Penguins. So this is the 4th Stanley Cup in their franchise's history. Now, in getting to the Stanley Cup final, here's who they had to beat. They had to beat Henrik Lundqvist. They had to beat the Vezina Trophy winner in Braden Holtby for the Capitals, and of course, that rivalry is very fierce in the postseason. They had to beat the runner-up for the Vezina as well in Ben Bishop, and then in the final, you could argue the only reason why they didn't sweep the Sharks is because of Martin Jones. So he certainly had a hot hand in the postseason. Just like with the Blues, the Penguins had to replace their coach midway through the season, so out goes Mike Johnston, in comes Mike Sullivan, and Matt Murray, as a rookie goaltender, wins a Stanley Cup for them. And of course, we know about Crosby, Malkin, Letang, and even Fleury on this team, but as part of this 2016 team, you definitely have to give some kudos out there for Phil Kessel, who they brought in, and that HBK line with Carl Hagelin and also Nick Bonino just absolutely wreaked havoc on their opponents. You also had Brian Rust on the team now, Brian Dumoulin, Matt Cullen, the ageless wonder, and Patrick Hornqvist in front of the net. In 11th is a team that I would actually advocate to put a little bit higher, and that's the 2011 Boston Bruins. It was their 6th Stanley Cup in franchise history and their first since 1972. Of course, we know it's the start of something great with the likes of their core. Zdeno Chara, the captain, Patrice Bergeron, Brad Marchand, David Krejci actually led all postseason scorers. Tim Thomas, just a wonderful run. I mean, I can't really put into words how dominant he was between the pipes, and of course he won the Conn Smythe. Mark Recchi was part of that team, so was a young Tyler Seguin and a young Milan Lucic. So this team was completely loaded. Now, getting there was not easy. They were down 2-0 in the first round against the Canadiens. They also, don't forget, were reverse swept in the postseason before. So for them to be resilient, to bounce back the next year and win the Stanley Cup is very impressive, and really capping this off was how they ultimately overcame the Vancouver Canucks. They were down 2-0 in that series, and that Canucks team, when we talk about the finalists in this list, I would argue that maybe that was the best finalist that didn't win the Stanley Cup. And for them to really decisively win Game 7 on the road in Vancouver, that was huge too. In 10th, I have the 2020 Tampa Bay Lightning in the Bubble Cup, yes, right? But somebody had to win it, and Tampa was head and shoulders the best team there. I'm going to put up a comment here from Dean, who was talking about some of that sort of adversity going into it. Not to mention, this team didn't have Steven Stamkos. So that is one reason why I vaulted them a little bit higher up on this list. And when it comes to that performance rating, this team was actually the 4th best on this list. So I want to give them some kudos. You had that core with Andrei Vasilevsky anchoring things between the pipes, Victor Hedman, Nikita Kucherov, who won the Hart Trophy just the year before. Braden Point could be a Hall of Famer as well. You had other great supporting roles filled by the likes of Ryan McDonough, Yanni Gourde, just an absolute pest, Barclay Goodrow, same with him. Tyler Johnson, Carter Verhaeghe even was on this roster. Now, just like the 2011 Bruins, the 2020 Lightning were coming off that embarrassing performance against the Blue Jackets in the first round the year before. So they exercised the demons, and they started that by beating the Blue Jackets in 2020 in Game 1 in 5 overtimes. So it was kind of all downhill from there. The Islanders kind of gave them a tough run, and the Stars had Anton Khudobin, but the Lightning, I still think, were clearly the best team that were in the postseason that year. For 9th on my list, I have the 2008 Detroit Red Wings, and I know a lot of you out there picked them as the best team. And really, in terms of just overall performance from the start of the season all the way through the Stanley Cup final, out of these 17 teams, they might have actually been the best. Detroit Red Wings hockey was still at its peak as we got into the late aughts. So it was no surprise that they just completely wreaked havoc in the postseason and won the Stanley Cup. And they beat the Pittsburgh Penguins to do so, that young core of Crosby and Malkin and so on and so forth. But anyway, look at this roster, man. Chris Chelios, Nick Lidstrom, Pavel Datsyuk, Henrik Zetterberg, the goaltending tandem of Chris Osgood and Dominik Hasek. And you also had the grind line, right? Kirk Maltby, Chris Draper, Darren McCarty. So this was the final ride. This was their last run as the best team in the NHL, and they would still be competitive for many years. I actually saw an article from thescore.com that this was the best cup-winning team in Detroit Red Wings history. So I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that in the comments down below. In 8th, I have the 2010 Chicago Blackhawks, and I actually lived in Chicago at that time, and that team was just steamrolling opponents, and that's what they did en route to a Stanley Cup championship. I mean, they went through my San Jose Sharks, who were the number 1 seed in the conference, and swept them. And even though the Flyers at one point tied up the Stanley Cup final at 2 games apiece, entering the final, there was no doubt in my mind this Chicago team would win the Stanley Cup. And they did this with the formation of a pretty young core and one that consists of several future Hall of Famers as well. So let me just read some of these names, right? Of course, Patrick Kane and the captain, Jonathan Toews, Marian Hossa, Duncan Keith could be a future Hall of Famer, Nicholas Hjalmarsson, one of the best shutdown defensemen of that era, Brent Seabrook, Patrick Sharp, Dustin Byfuglien was just an absolute nuisance on the ice. Brian Campbell, too, you can't forget him. Antti Niemi had a great run as their goaltender that year as well. So being able to beat some top teams in the Western Conference like the Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, who would emerge around that time as well, and winning their 4th Stanley Cup in franchise history and snapping, I should say, a 39-year Stanley Cup drought. Now, when I looked at other rankings, I saw this specific team actually ranked higher up. So again, let me know in the comments down below. I have the 2013 Chicago Blackhawks. So this is the middle championship of their 3 in the 2010s, the 5th in franchise history. And this is the most recent President's Trophy winning team to win a Stanley Cup. Now, those Red Wings fans, right? That team had actually played an 82-game season, won the President's Trophy, and won the Cup. So they were the last team to do that. I will be sure to point that out. But anyway, these Hawks were still fantastic. One reason why is because they actually beat the 2 previous Stanley Cup champions. So they beat the Boston Bruins in the final, and they also beat the previous year's champion, the LA Kings. Now in the final, they trailed in the series 2-1 against the Bruins. They won Game 4 in overtime. So by the skin of their teeth, they were able to pull this off. And in Game 6, right, the Bruins have that lead at the very end with 76 seconds left in the game. The Blackhawks score twice and win the Stanley Cup. Not to mention, they actually trailed in their series against the Red Wings in the second round 3-1. So they had to win 3 straight in a row against their most hated rival at that time just to, keep the Stanley Cup dream alive. Now, the core was mostly the same as I just talked about, but I do want to also mention that they had Corey Crawford in goal, and he had a fantastic run. Brian Bickle was actually second on the team in scoring. I never would have thought that. And Brandon Saad was also a key contributor to this team. Now we get to 6th on this list, and I have the 2007 Anaheim Anaheim Ducks. I remember this team, in addition to the Red Wings, being very dominant in the Western Conference at this time. This was loaded with all sorts of star talent, both experienced and new. But with this team in particular, they had the third best performance rating. I don't think their competition was the stiffest by any means, but really they steamrolled their opponents quite a bit, including in the final against the Ottawa Senators. Once that Stanley Cup matchup was set, there was no chance in hell that the Senators could pull that off. I didn't think so, because they were going up against the likes of Chris Pronger, who was brought in from the Oilers and had taken them all the way to Game 7 the year before. Scott Niedermayer and Rob Niedermayer, let's not forget him. Of course, the Finnish Flash, Teemu Selänne, in his second run with the Ducks franchise. Chris Kunitz, right, who's won 4 Stanley Cups in his career and might be the last player to ever do that, considering we're in the salary cap era. Jean-Sebastien Giguère and Ilya Bryzgalov, maybe the best tandem in the NHL at that time. And let's not also forget Ryan Getzlaf, who led all playoff scorers for the Ducks, and Corey Perry. These guys were at the start of their career, and they were already making a huge impact. So this Ducks team, it was very difficult to see any team being able to get through them. Now in 5th is my favorite Stanley Cup run of this era, and it's the 2018 Washington Capitals. It was such a special, remarkable run. The first ever Cup victory for the Washington Capitals after 44 years. Of course, Alex Ovechkin being the linchpin of that team, and that core of players had been really expected to win at least one Stanley Cup for a number of years. They had won President's trophies. They had been known as choke artists, and so they finally got over the hump, and they did so in quite a dramatic fashion. They started the playoffs with Philip Grubauer in net. They were trailing the series against the Columbus Blue Jackets in the first round 2-0. And then they put in Braden Holtby. He gets his game back together. They exorcised the demons by finally beating the Pittsburgh Penguins with an overtime goal in Game 6. And then they beat Andrei Vasilevsky and the Tampa Bay Lightning. They were down 3-2 in that series, and they shut out the Lightning in the final 2 games. And then waiting for them is the Vegas Golden Knights in their first ever year. And by no means were they any slouch, because they beat the shit out of every team in the Western Conference. Their record after Game 1, they won Game 1 of the final, don't forget. They had a 13-3 postseason records. They looked like world beaters out there despite being an expansion franchise. But ultimately, the Capitals, with Braden Holtby in net, some clutch scoring, Devontae Smith-Pelly, Lars Eller, they were finally able to get over the hump and break through that barrier. It's a very special run, in my opinion, and that's one reason why I've got Ovechkin raising the cup behind me here. Now in 4th on my list, I have the 2022 Avalanche. This team, in terms of performance rating, was actually tied for first, so they dominated quite a bit. Granted, they didn't have to face Jussi Saros in the first round when they played the Predators, but they swept them. They took down the Blues in 6 games, and then they swept McDavid and Draisaitl, so you can't forget that. And then finally, in the Stanley Cup, they went up against their toughest competition in terms of goaltending with Vasilevsky and the Lightning, and they were able to be the better team over the course of that 6-game series. Of course, plenty of future Hall of Famers on this team in the likes of McKinnon, I think Rantanen, Makar, Landeskog, I think, will certainly be in that mix, maybe even Devon Taves. So they were stacked with great depth as well, too. You can't forget about that. And they won, I believe, 9 straight games on the road, which I don't know if anybody's ever going to do that again. So just a tremendous team, and they had been expected to make a Stanley Cup run for the previous couple of seasons, and so they finally got over that hump. And in winning the Stanley Cup, they played some of the best postseason hockey, some of the most exciting hockey to watch, I think. In 3rd on my list, I have the 2014 Los Angeles Kings. Now, some of you out there think they should be number 1. We'll talk about a couple other teams in just a second here. This was a remarkable run because they were down and out, right? They were down 3-0 in the first round against the Sharks. They reverse sweep them. I don't forget about that, unfortunately. And then they have to face another hated rival in the Anaheim Ducks, who were great at this time, and they win in 7. And then they win in 7 again against the Blackhawks, the defending champion and one of the more dominant teams of that era as well. Now, because they won 3 of those series in 7 games, that means their performance rating is the 3rd lowest on this list. But with their backs against the wall multiple times, and to come out as a champion and to do so in pretty dominating fashion against Lundqvist and the New York Rangers, I have to definitely editorialize this and push them up toward the top because, again, they just came back from the grave to win the Stanley Cup and to do so against some pretty great competition. In second, I've got the 2009 Pittsburgh Penguins, the first Stanley Cup with that core of Crosby, Malkin, Letang, and Marc-Andre Fleury. And these guys were just in their early 20s, right? So for them to not only win the Stanley Cup at this point, but to beat the team that beat them in the final the previous year, the Detroit Red Wings, not to mention they were down 2-0 in that series. And ultimately, they just were able to hang on by a thread at the end of Game 7. Marc-Andre Fleury making that save where he slid over. That was one hell of a run. And like 2016, they actually had to relieve their head coach midseason in Michel Therrien, and in comes Dan Bylsma. Not to mention, they also had to defeat the Washington Capitals, the first battle between Ovechkin and Crosby in the postseason, and the Penguins ultimately prevailed in 7. And to top it all off, this really is the start of something great for the Penguins, of course, winning 2 more Stanley Cups and being in the playoffs and making runs all the way up until this season. So you have to definitely factor that in as well. And number 1 on my list is the 2012 Los Angeles Kings. They were the first 8th seed or lowest seeded team in the field of 16 to win a Stanley Cup, and they did so in completely dominant fashion. They only needed a total of 20 games to win the Stanley Cup. They got through the Western Conference teams in 5 games, 4 games, and then 5 games before facing Martin Brodeur and the New Jersey Devils and dispatching them in 6 games. Now, they wouldn't have been able to do this without the likes of Jonathan Quick, the Conn Smythe winner, an incredible run through the playoffs for him, as his team was actually second from the bottom in goals for per game in the regular season. And apart from ending a 45-year cup drought, this really does catalyze a great run for the LA Kings throughout the 2010s. Of course, the next year, they are eliminated by the would-be champion Chicago Blackhawks in 7 games, but then they win it the next year and they challenge a couple other times in the playoffs. Once again, I want to thank our sponsor, World Hockey Manager. Make sure you see the pinned comment down below for a download link and also the promotional code to net you 100 gold coins. So what do you think about my rankings? Let me know in the comments down below. Feel free to shout out other suggestions for videos kind of like this, and I hope to see you around for more coverage of the Stanley Cup playoffs and through the offseason and beyond. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Make sure you leave a thumbs up before you go. I'm Nick, and I'll catch you Twisters later. Ciao.